In the remote mountains of America, where nobody lived for miles around and the nearest town was hours away through winding, dangerous roads, 5 young friends were driving together in their car to find a cabin where they could spend their weekend away from the stress and noise of city life. And the group consisted of Scott, who was the most experienced driver and was handling the steering wheel, while his girlfriend, Sherry, sat next to him looking at the crumpled map they had brought to help them navigate. And in the back seat there was Ash, who was trying to sleep against the window next to his girlfriend Linda, with Ash's younger sister Cheryl squeezed uncomfortably between all their camping equipment, food supplies, and coolers they had packed for what they hoped would be a fun and relaxing vacation. The cabin they were looking for was something that Ash and Scott had discovered several weeks earlier when they were spending hours searching online through different websites that offered cheap vacation rentals for college students. And this particular listing had promised that the place was located in a beautiful and peaceful mountain location with clean, fresh air and lots of tall trees all around it. And the best part of the deal was the unusual satisfaction guarantee policy that meant if they were not completely happy with what they found when they got there, they would not have to pay any money at all for their stay, which seemed like an absolutely perfect arrangement for students who did not have much money to spend on expensive vacations and wanted to make sure they got good value for whatever they did spend. As they drove higher and higher up into the mountains where there were active logging operations with huge trucks constantly carrying loads of cut trees down the steep and narrow winding roads, Scott had to be extremely careful and alert to avoid dangerous crashes with these massive vehicles that would suddenly appear around blind corners without any warning. And one particularly large timber truck came so close to hitting them head-on that Scott had to quickly swerve their car onto the very narrow shoulder of the road where there was barely enough space to avoid going over the edge, which scared everyone in the car very badly, because they suddenly realized that if anything serious happened to them up here in such a remote wilderness area, their car insurance would probably not cover accidents that occurred so far away from normal civilization. When they had been driving for many hours through increasingly wild and empty landscape and were finally getting close to the location that was marked on their map, they encountered 2 weathered and rough-looking mountain men who appeared to be local residents, and these men were standing beside their old and rusty pickup truck on the side of the road. When they saw Scott's car approaching them, they raised their hands up in the air, but it was not the kind of friendly wave that people usually do when they want to say hello or when they want someone to stop and give them a ride. But instead it seemed like they were making some kind of urgent warning gesture, trying to tell Scott and his friends to turn their car around and go back the way they had come from, almost as if they knew something dangerous that the young people did not know about. When Linda asked Scott to explain again how he had found this particular cabin rental, Scott told his worried friends that he had spent many hours carefully comparing dozens of different rental listings on various websites, reading all the reviews and checking all the prices, and this cabin had stood out from all the others because it offered such a low price, combined with the owner's very unusual guarantee policy that promised complete satisfaction or no payment required. So, after discussing it with Ash, they had both agreed that this seemed like an opportunity that would be crazy to pass up. The final landmark that they had to reach before arriving at the cabin was an old wooden bridge that crossed over a deep rocky valley where a small stream ran at the bottom. But when they got to this bridge, they could see that it was in extremely poor condition after many years of weather damage and neglect, with rotting wooden planks that sagged dangerously and support beams that looked like they might not be strong enough to hold the weight of a car. And when Scott carefully drove their vehicle onto this questionable bridge, the inevitable disaster happened as the car's weight caused the deteriorated wood to break through halfway across, leaving their rear wheels hanging over empty air above the deep valley below until Scott realized they were in serious trouble and floored the accelerator pedal, using their car's momentum and engine power to speed across the remaining distance and reach the solid ground on the other side. The cabin sat alone in a small clearing surrounded by dark forest, and although it matched the photos from the website, it looked much more foreboding in real life, with decades of neglect showing in the warped wood and moss-covered roof. And despite there being no wind at all, an old porch swing kept hitting the cabin wall in a steady rhythm that immediately stopped the moment Scott reached up and found the hidden key above the door. While his friends brought their bags inside, Scott decided to explore the basement and discovered it was filled with hunting and butchering tools, including saws, knives, and other sharp implements that he assumed the previous owner had used for processing wild game. So he did not think there was anything particularly strange or threatening about finding all these cutting tools in the basement of a remote mountain cabin. That evening, while Cheryl was quietly drawing, and the others were relaxing with beer. The old clock chimed 6 o'clock, even though it was running 10 minutes slow, and at that exact moment the pendulum stopped swinging, while a mysterious voice from outside called to them saying, "Join us." And immediately Cheryl began acting strangely, as if controlled by an invisible force that made her draw geometric box shapes before the basement door creaked open by itself. Later during dinner, the basement door suddenly swung wide open again with a loud crash that startled everyone. And although Cheryl insisted the place felt creepy and they should avoid the basement, Scott had been drinking and felt brave enough to investigate, especially since his girlfriend Sherry was encouraging him to go see what was down there. So he grabbed a flashlight and went down alone, while telling the others to wait upstairs. After Scott had been gone for more than 10 minutes without making any sound, Ash became worried and went down to check on him. And in the eerie basement atmosphere with signs that someone had been living there, Ash found Scott in a workshop room filled with guns, books, a tape recorder, and other mysterious items, including a book written entirely in strange symbols and a wooden staff with a small skull embedded in it. They brought everything upstairs and played the tape recorder, which contained recordings of a professor explaining how he and his colleagues had been studying ancient Sumerian ruins, and after completing their official work, he had stayed with his wife at this cabin to continue his private research, during which he discovered an ancient book about burial customs and resurrection incantations that scholars had translated as the Book of the Dead. The professor explained that this terrible book had pages made from human skin with text written in human blood, and it contained instructions for bringing dead people back to life, and warned that evil spirits could use the same magical words to possess and control living people. But Scott thought this was all nonsense, while Cheryl found it frightening and wanted to stop listening. When Scott turned the recorder back on to hear more of what he considered silly stories, they did not realize the next part contained actual incantations, and as these strange chanting sounds filled the cabin, supernatural changes began happening outside, including a massive tree that crashed through their window and sent Cheryl running to a room in terror. Ash decided they should pack away these frightening materials and get some sleep, so he went to Linda and gave her a beautiful magnifying glass necklace as a romantic gift. And as they embraced and became intimate, they did not notice something outside watching them through the windows, while Cheryl, in her room, heard the mysterious voice calling her again and followed it into the forest. In the dark woods, evil tree vines suddenly reached out like living creatures and wrapped around Cheryl, binding her tightly and tearing her clothes until she was left in just her nightgown, and these supernatural vines began spreading her legs apart and moving toward her in a threatening way. But she managed to use all her strength to break free and run back to the cabin, where Ash and Linda quickly pulled her inside to safety. When they saw Cheryl's torn clothing and terrified condition, Linda suggested they help her calm down in her room, but Cheryl insisted she was fine and that they needed to leave immediately because something was dangerously wrong with this forest, though Scott refused to waste their money by leaving after just one afternoon. So Ash decided to drive Cheryl to the nearest town while the others stayed one more night. But when Ash and Cheryl reached their car and drove to where the bridge should be, they discovered it had completely collapsed, trapping them at the cabin with no way to return to civilization, which made Cheryl cry because she believed evil forces were deliberately preventing their escape. So they had no choice but to return to the cabin, since staying outside in the haunted forest would be even more dangerous. Back at the cabin, Ash thought Cheryl might have been scared by the professor's recordings, so he played another tape which revealed that the professor's wife had become possessed by evil spirits, and the only way to stop someone controlled by these supernatural forces was dismemberment. But since the professor could not bring himself to kill his wife, he had fled the cabin after accidentally awakening the evil spirits through his research. While Ash listened to these disturbing revelations, Linda and Sherry were playing a card-guessing game where Sherry pretended Linda was getting the answers right when she was actually wrong every time. And Linda believed she might have psychic abilities. But then Cheryl suddenly began correctly predicting every card in an eerie voice before her face changed to look possessed, and she said that he has awakened, and they would all die like those before them, then collapsed. When Linda approached to help Cheryl, she noticed her eyes looked completely different from normal. And while she was staring at these strange eyes, Cheryl grabbed a pencil from the floor and stabbed it into Linda's foot, causing blood to flow, then slapped Linda so hard she was knocked backwards, and it appeared Cheryl was preparing to attack again. Scott immediately saw the danger and picked up an axe to knock Cheryl down, then kicked her into the basement and locked the door while they could all hear her voice from below, continuously chanting, "Join us," in a way that no longer sounded like Cheryl at all. And after helping Linda to a bedroom to rest from her injury, Scott and Sherry kept watch over the locked basement door. When everything seemed quiet for a long time, Scott told Sherry to go rest since it had been such an exhausting day. But she had only been in her room for a few minutes when she heard strange sounds outside her window and saw something approaching that she could not identify. And then came her screaming as something broke through the glass and dragged her away. Scott ran to help, but found the room empty with a broken window. And just as he was about to search outside, Sherry jumped out from hiding with long red claws and scratched his face before attacking him with supernatural strength. And when the noise reached the basement, Cheryl also became agitated and tried to break out to join the fight. Scott managed to throw possessed Sherry into the fireplace where she caught fire. But when he pulled her out, hoping the flames might free her from the evil spirit's control, she looked even more terrifying and continued attacking. So during their violent struggle, where Ash tried to help but got pinned under a fallen cabinet, Scott had to use a knife to cut Sherry's wrist, which caused her to bite off her own hand. Scott used the severed hand as a weapon since it seemed to have magical properties against the possessed Sherry. And when she finally seemed defeated, she used her last strength to grab him and threatened to take him with her. But Ash was too terrified to help with the axe, so Scott had to dismember Sherry himself, while the evil spirit tried to manipulate him by speaking in her voice about love. After burying Sherry's remains outside, they decided Scott should scout ahead for escape routes, while Ash stayed with injured Linda. But Scott returned badly wounded, saying Cheryl had been right, that the evil forces would not let them leave. And while he spoke, both Cheryl from the basement and Linda began laughing maniacally until Ash slapped Linda and threatened her with a gun, causing her to return to normal. Cheryl also seemed normal and asked to be released, but when Ash approached the basement door, she broke through and grabbed him while Linda became possessed again. So Ash dragged Linda outside, where Scott died from his severe injuries, leaving Ash as the only normal person to fight the possessed Linda, who attacked him with the skull staff. Ash reluctantly stabbed Linda and tried to bury her with dignity, but she revived and clawed his leg, forcing him to beat her with a wooden club that proved ineffective against her supernatural strength. So he grabbed a nearby chainsaw and decapitated her, finally ending that battle. When Ash returned to find Cheryl had escaped the basement, they played a deadly game of hide-and-seek through the cabin where blood flowed from burst pipes, and the phonograph played recordings of their earlier conversations, and the clock's hands moved by themselves to show 10 minutes before 6, the same time Cheryl had been drawing her strange boxes. Cheryl ambushed Ash and tried to strangle him, but his wild gunshot hit her jaw, and then Scott also revived and grabbed Ash's throat. So during their three-way battle, the Book of the Dead fell near the fireplace, and Ash realized destroying it might end the curse, but he had to gouge Scott's eyes to break free. When Cheryl grabbed his foot to prevent him from reaching the book, Ash used Linda's magnifying glass necklace chain as a hook to pull the book close enough to grab, and when he threw it into the fire, both Scott and Cheryl stopped moving, and their bodies began melting away as the evil spirits burst out, but returned to dormant state, still whispering, "Join us." After everything ended, Ash left the cabin but saw new evil spirits rushing toward him from the forest. And this story comes from a famous horror movie series with 5 films so far and a 6th planned for 2026.